Hello again, book lovers. The Savage Frontier, The Pyrenees in History and the Imagination by Matthew Carr. And as this book was lent to me by a fellow Englishman who lives just up the road in Biescas, I thought I'd better romp through it before I get it dog-eared and stained with tea. And that I did, and quite easily, as it was very entertaining, having just watched a film which more or less told the story that I thought would be worth novelising, which was Agora, by the way. I now read a book which I'd thought about writing, as I don't know how many histories of the Pyrenees there have been. Well, quite a few. This is a very recent one from 8 years ago. It started off as it meant to go on, with lots of history, local knowledge, and as I step back now and have a look at it from afar, you see, look at all these people who've actually had cause to be in or explore or flee over the Pyrenees. Arthur Koestler, Hilaire Belloc, Beachcomber, Pau Casals, Walter Benjamin, Laurie Lee, Arthur Koestler, Hannah Arendt, Airy Neve, who was escaping from Colditz, Chuck Yeager, who got shot down in the war and had to cross, as so many people did in the France to Spain route, to get as far as Lisbon if they possibly could. He had to clamber over the Pyrenees, considering the mountains to be, quote, a bitch of bitches. Phoebus of Foix didn't think so, of course. He was the romantic that lived in a time and place which is now bathed in romanticism for us. And as I cycled over the other side of the Pyrenees a couple of years ago, I noticed the Route Henri IV, wondering what was so special about Henry IV. Well, now I know there's some nice snippets in here which make me inclined to read a little bit more about this lover of the mountains and son of the cruel Jean d'Albret. Fleeing the other way were the Jews, of course, in 1391 and 1492, but also, under Felipe III, the expulsion of the Moriscos, the Moros, or Moors, who were supposedly Christianized. Apparently Felipe III wasn't convinced, chucked them out, and over the Pyrenees they fled. A mountain which has hosted anarchist fiefdoms, smugglers, adventurers, utopian hippies, an art school in Serret, which was connected to Picasso, Cauteretz, the Spa town, which became popular late 19th century for Parisians who could get there in one day by train, and so they became a sort of seaside town replacement option. And of many French visitors here, those that struggled up Tourmalet on the Tour de France are also getting a mention, alongside some of the legendary stories, particularly that of Eugène Christophe. But they're not all goodies. In fact, as is stressed in the book, the mountains in general were seen as places of terror until a couple of hundred years ago. Henry Patrick Russell Killoch and his like-minded English and Irish friends began to explore them and try to be the first up the peaks as far as anybody knew. But be careful, there are bears up there. Ferrage the cannibal, who lived in a cave, apparently a real person who abducted and murdered people in the valleys. The mysterious Cagots, a whole race of people, nobody knows exactly where they came from, a lot of origin theories, but they were treated as lepers, which some people thought they were, carrying some kind of disease, and eventually died out. There are bears that became so famous they got their own names, but they were gradually eliminated over the years, remaining as the sad dancing bears that got taken around the villages, which apparently were very popular around here as well. We hear of Escartine, who took the last photographs of the peasants in the villages with the Pyrenees as the backdrop. Obviously those days have gone. Industrialisation and much better transport led to people abandoning the villages, and there's a nice section on some of the abandoned villages. Aineye is a star around here as being the subject of Julio Llamazares' famous novel Yellow Rain, and is a very evocative telling of the story of how a village can be left to die. In fact, there's a nice anecdote about Aissa, where 12 smugglers were found and set to be punished, but the local curate said, "Could you let them off, please, because they're the only men in the village. What are we going to do without the men?" These days, of course, the Pyrenees is more famous for holidaying, really. Cycling, if you like that, which I do. Skiing, very popular still, while the glaciers still haven't entirely melted. Fell walking, or les randonneurs as they call it, over the border, and our author is obviously very keen on that. Tells us the story of going up in Catalonia, where one of his buddies explains to somebody who he calls the Northern Catalan, because he comes from Perpignan, that he's there, quote, to escape the shit that is Spain, end quote. Well, if this was supposed to be a nice local personage, I'm afraid he came across as an overweight, lumbering boor to me, bringing his black cloud of politics to the mountains. And in general, the folk that live up here are portrayed as quite hardy, but also quite welcoming. And so, to conclude, after saying that I very much enjoyed this book and would recommend it, an excellent start to anyone that wants to know about the Pyrenees in general, yes, this is a good one. However, I'm going to finish with some nitpickings and some omissions. So here comes my nitpicking. Okay. The famous anarchist leader Durruti was described as Aragonese, which, although he fought here in Aragon, he definitely wasn't. And the founding of Andorra by Charlemagne, Carlomagno, is stated as fact a couple of times here, where I've been led to believe it's not entirely certain that it was Charlemagne that set that deal up, as it were. Good news, Mr. Carr. The road to Ibort, the unusual hippie village, a mere 8 kilometres from me, is now tarmacked. And the rundown situation that our author encountered in Canfranc has been much improved. The station is now converted into a hotel, the idea being that finally we will link via the train tunnel to France again. They say within 6 years. I hope I'm not dead by then, because I would love to get on the train and just go straight across, or in this case through a bit of the Pyrenees, and miraculously emerge in France. It would take me, in fact, to the little village of Bedouce en route, which is where I begin my omissions. The founder of St. Louis in America is from Bedouce. I discovered while I was there, as I also discovered that we have witches around here. In Acumuer, for example, you don't have to go all the way to Zugarramurdi in the Basque country, which is the more famous witch spot. Oh yeah, we got them here, Villanua as well. That's why we have the odd-shaped chimneys with those tops on, to stop the witches coming down them. Also useful for stopping snow. More omissions. Because, you know, I mean, you can't get everything in, can you? But I happen to live here, so, and even though I'm only talking about really from the Roncal Valley to the Ordesa Valley, which is my neck of the woods on the Spanish side, we didn't get the Giant of Sallent, who was quite a well-known figure around here. And if you talk to people about the Civil War, there's plenty of other scurrilous characters that are known about around here. There was a bit further over, in Saravillo, was the anarchist curate of Saravillo. Curious story which I haven't got to the bottom of. Then there were the swallows, as they were known, which were the women workers that while the men were out doing the transhumantia, moving the pasturage of the cattle and the sheep, well, they had to get a living somehow, so off they went with the children to factories in France, very often walking over the Pyrenees. And the traffic came the other way in the form of agricultural and even chocolate factories, which made their way from France into the High Aragon, where I am, and down as far as Zaragoza. Another story that's not in is about the Moorish failed attack on Jaca, which is celebrated every first Friday in May. And two visitors that I discovered prior to reading this book that I've never heard made mention of. Edward I of England came to the Pyrenees twice, as far as I can figure out, for sort of peace conferences to divvy up the Spanish states, or what is now France. As far as I know, he went once to Canfranc and once to Oloron, which is the other side of the mountains in France. Which is where, if we went a little bit west... Oh, by the way, the peculiar abandoned village Janovas, which is mentioned in detail, isn't west of Sariñánigo, it's east, just by the by. So, going west into the Basque Country again, in one famous battle, Gannibal partook, the black slave of St. Peter the Great, was sent down to do a bit of fighting down our way. And finally, Mr. Rahn, I should say Herr Rahn, the Nazi who came looking for the Holy Grail over here, was looking in the wrong place, if you ask my neighbours, as it was rumoured to have been kept at least for a time, in San Adrian de Sasabe, which is up the Canfranc Valley, the Aragon Valley, where when you get to the top, the huge mountains loom over you, which is just what you want from mountain scenery. Some of the mountains are telluric, by the way. That wasn't mentioned either. And these all help to create the myths of sacred triangles and ancient roots and all kinds of things that you might find up here with the ibex, the eagles and the bears.